Tourism is the second largest in
Canada's economy.
We're not going to make a series of concessions.
What do you make of this reporting that we're seeing?
Right. Well, just to take the quote from Howard.
If you skipped Florida this year, bought Okanagan wine instead of California, or stopped crossing the border for shopping, you didn't just make a consumer choice. You helped expose a weakness in Donald Trump's trade strategy, because for the first time in this standoff, the pushback is no longer just coming from Ottawa. It's coming from inside the United States, from American lawmakers looking at their own numbers and realizing the pressure campaign against Canada is starting to hit American jobs first. And here's the moment that changes the whole story.
Tourism is the second largest industry, both by revenue, and it supports 70,000 jobs. Canada has long been our largest share of foreign visitors, but last year we saw a 30% drop in Canadian tourism, largely due to the loss of trust and goodwill because of this administration's rhetoric around Canada. Secretary Lutnick, last week, you said about Canada's economic strategy, and I quote, "They suck." How does insulting our closest ally and neighbor help the businesses in my state of New Hampshire and states all across this country who are hurting because of the loss of Canadian business and tourism?
That is not a Canadian minister complaining. That is an American lawmaker in Washington telling the administration that its rhetoric is costing her state money. Right there. That's the key. Leverage that backfires isn't leverage. So let me ask you something. If a trade strategy starts hurting your own side first, is that still strength or just theater? Put your honest answer in the comments. Everyone keeps repeating the same frame. Canada depends on the United States more than the United States depends on Canada. And in broad export terms, yes, Canada sends roughly 70% of its exports south. But broad export dependence and sector dependence are not the same thing. That's where the story changes. Look at what the New Hampshire senator was actually saying. Tourism in her state is the second largest industry by revenue. It supports 70,000 jobs. Canadian visits were down 30%. That is not symbolic. That's payroll. That's hotel occupancy. That's restaurants, gas stations, outlet malls, ski towns, and family businesses.
There's no doubt about that, Mr. Secretary. But insulting our closest ally and neighbor who provides a lot of business. We have a lot of businesses in New Hampshire, small businesses who work on both sides of the border. We have all those Canadian visitors who are not coming because of your comments and comments by the administration. How does that help our economy?
How does that help our economy? That's the question Washington doesn't want asked out loud. Because once that question is asked honestly, the clean America strong, Canada weak narrative starts to fall apart. And that's not even the biggest vulnerability. Before I show you where the real dependency sits, you need to understand the trap Canada was being asked to walk into. One of the smartest things Canada has done in this entire dispute is something that looks passive from the outside, but is actually highly disciplined. It refused to pay an entry fee just to start negotiating. Listen to this.
We're not going to make a series of concessions or agree to a series of things that aren't in the interests of the Canadian economy, Canadian businesses, Canadian workers, just to get to a table and have a statement appear on a website in the United States to then receive a whole second list of things that they're going to want. So our list is much shorter than the Mexicans. We have solutions to most of what the Americans raised.
That is a serious point. Trade lawyers have a term for this kind of tactic: pre-negotiation conditionality. Basically, give me something first, then maybe I'll talk. That's not negotiation. That's paying cover charge before you even know what's on the menu. And Canada's answer was no. Now, some will say Canada is just stalling because it's weak. And if this were isolated, I might agree. But look at the pattern. Mexico moved faster because Mexico made earlier concessions on files Washington cared about. Canada didn't. Not because Ottawa enjoys pain, because Ottawa understood something simple. Once you concede before the talks start, the second list always comes. And that's exactly what the senator from New Hampshire was admitting without quite meaning to. The strategy isn't building pressure cleanly. It's creating collateral damage. Now, here's where it gets expensive. Canada is not just another export market for the United States. Canada is embedded inside core American supply chains. And in some sectors, the replacement options are politically ugly. A former Canadian ambassador laid this out very plainly.
What do you make of this reporting that we're seeing, of course, and you've talked about this, that there should be an entry fee or concessions made before Canada even comes to the table?
Right. Well, just to take the quote from Howard Lutnick, I think it's very much his style to simplify matters that way and to couch it as if Canada owes the United States something. It is the position that the president is trying to take, that really they are coming from strength and we are the asker here. I think we have to be careful not to fall into that trap. I think, this is the issue when we talk about being dependent on the United States. I think we forget to also say in that same breath is the United States is dependent on us. They need our fertilizer. They need our oil. They need our agricultural products. They need our services and many, many other, our aluminum, our steel even. So I think everyone's trying to find the right stance.
That's the reality. The U.S. needs Canadian oil. It needs Canadian potash for fertilizer. It needs Canadian aluminum. It needs Canadian uranium. And here's the line that should make anyone in Washington stop and breathe for a second. The United States' next major uranium alternative after Canada is Russia. Let that sink in. Insulting allies is not an economic strategy. If your replacement supplier on a strategic input is Russia, you are not negotiating from some all-powerful position. You are gambling with your own industrial base. This isn't the first time Washington thought pressure alone would produce obedience. In 2018, the first Trump administration hit Canada with steel and aluminum tariffs under the absurd claim that Canadian metals were somehow a national security threat. Canadian retaliation followed. U.S. manufacturers complained. American import costs rose. The tariffs were eventually lifted because the domestic blowback was too expensive. That's the historical pattern. Push Canada. Canada absorbs the hit. Then American industries start calling Congress, governors, and cabinet secretaries asking why they're being punished in a fight that was supposed to hurt the other guy. And honestly, this is the part I think people miss most. When Canada doesn't panic, it forces the consequences of Washington's strategy to stay in Washington longer. That's not emotional strength. That's institutional patience. But forget the commodities for a second. Think about the border economy in human terms. A motel owner in New Hampshire doesn't care about White House swagger. She cares whether Canadians book rooms in ski season. A small liquor distributor doesn't care about performative insults. He cares whether shelves move. A family-run restaurant near the border doesn't care about rhetorical chest thumping. They care whether Friday traffic is normal or empty. This is where these fights stop being abstract. When trust drops, people stop crossing. When people stop crossing, revenue drops. When revenue drops, jobs disappear. That's not ideology. That's the mortgage, and it's why some of the sharpest criticism is now coming from inside the American system itself. Save this video, screenshot this. These are the 3 questions that will tell you who's actually winning this fight. Question 1. Who benefits financially from escalation? U.S. dairy lobby, spirits producers, domestic political consultants, follow the money. Question 2. What meetings happen in the 72 hours before new demands appear? Because when rhetoric suddenly hardens, somebody usually had a meeting first. Question 3. Who's fighting hardest against Canada? Finding alternatives. If American industries panic when Canada talks about Asia or Europe, that tells you exactly where the dependency sits. That framework works here. It'll work on the next trade story too. Now, one more question for you before I make the call. Who backs down first here? Washington, because the pain hits home, or Ottawa, because the U.S. market is still too important? I'm genuinely curious where you land. Here's my prediction. The administration will keep the aggressive tone publicly because politically it likes the optics of dominance. But in the next phase of talks, the actual negotiating position will soften, not because Canada folded, but because more American stakeholders will start saying what that senator said. This is hurting us. You'll see it in three places. First, more U.S. governors and senators from border states will complain publicly about lost Canadian business. Second, American business groups tied to tourism, agriculture, and cross-border retail will push for a reset in tone. Third, Washington will quietly reframe its demands from make concessions before talks to let's resolve outstanding issues quickly. That's the tell. If that happens, then Canada's strategy, absorb the pressure, refuse the entry fee, expand alternatives, and let the contradictions surface inside the U.S., will have worked exactly as intended. Not because Canada shouted louder, because it waited longer. And in Canada, use relations, that distinction matters more than most people realize. The pressure isn't breaking Canada. It's exposing the design flaw in the pressure itself. That's the real story.